Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to start up our council meeting again. It's just after 2 o'clock, and we recessed after approving the 2017 budgets, and we're on to the rest of our agenda here in the final meeting of 2016. And the next piece on the agenda for us is considering the reports that council held for debate and separate vote. And there are 3 of them: Communications 1, Policy Report 1, and Policy Report 3. The first one is Communications 1, which I held, and that is Standing Committee Chairs and Vice Chairs and Nomination Subcommittee report. I've sent to the clerk some revised language because I've made a change to the appointees to the Standing Committee on City Finance and Services. Councillor Heather Deal as Chair and Councillor Jeff Meggs as Vice Chair. Otherwise, the report remains the same as posted on the agenda. And thanks for your great service as Chair, Councillor Meggs, and a stellar 2017 budget. No, it's the golden handshake. You worked so hard at this. Noting that Councillor Meggs will be Deputy Mayor in 2017, so their workload intensifies dramatically. You can ask Councillor Heather Deal and Councillor Andrea Reimer about that. So that's the only change. I'll move with that as part of the motion on the table in this communication. I need a seconder for moving that. Councillor Reimer, did you second that? Any debate on that piece? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. Now we're on to the second report, which is Policy Report number 1. And Policy Report number 1 is CD1 rezoning for 575 Drake Street, the Covenant House. And Councillor Carr, you requested that one.
At the public hearing, Mr. Mayor, my first question is around the public response. I noticed that there was a verbal, or there's a written description, but there's not a sense of how many people were either for or against this project, and I wonder if you could provide more details at the public hearing around that in terms of specifics. Thank you. Secondly, if you could also at the public hearing, because I imagine this may be a matter raised by the public, what is the precedent for us treating a social service land use as social housing? I'm not sure if this is unique, first time, but I would like to know that. And if you could, a third question, if you could provide the percentage of the space that will be social housing. Those are my questions, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
I'm happy to move the referral.
Thank you for that. And we need a seconder for that. Councillor Stevenson, any discussion referring that to public hearing? All those in favor of referral? Any opposed? That carries. So that Drake Street rezoning will go to public hearing. And next on the held reports is Policy Report number 3, that's Facilitating Growth in Vancouver's Innovation Economy, Mount Pleasant Industrial Area Amendments to the Zoning and Development Bylaw. Councillor Reimer.
Thank you, Mayor Robertson. I had some questions on this, which could be answered today or at public hearing. Either way is fine with me. Related specifically to the property at 123 East 6th Avenue, the Simon Fraser Annex. The first question arises from a group called the Light and Love Home, which I understand holds a commercial lease on the site with us. That organization has alleged that the city has said that it has plans to sell the site. I have been unable to corroborate these allegations, which apparently were heard verbally by them, but they have no written proof or other witnesses who've seen it. Could you clarify what the city's intentions are with the property at this time?
Sure. Mr. Mayor, Council, Bill Ochila, General Manager for Real Estate and Facilities Management. With respect to that particular group and that particular site, Council, as you know, if we were ever to negotiate a sale with anybody, we would come to Council first to seek authority for negotiating a direct sale. Otherwise, a sale is done through a public process, which is competitively bid in the general public. We have done neither of those things. We are not negotiating with anyone. That particular group has a 2-year lease with a 5-year option to extend. And at this time, we have no plans, but would like the planning process continue.
Okay, that is very helpful clarification. Also to note, this group they're a nonprofit, but they have a commercial lease with the city.
That is my understanding.
So we would need to treat them the same way we would any other commercial tenant.
That is correct.
Okay. So I guess what I would say, Mayor Robertson, I do have concerns in regards to some communications that this group has sent out in relation to the public hearing that appear, and I have met with them, they state it's not their intention, but it certainly appears that they're trying to use the public hearing process to influence the terms of a commercial lease, which would be highly inappropriate, certainly for council to be influenced by it, but probably inappropriate for them to engage in that as a leasee. So I think some clarification of that in advance of the public hearing so that they're clear when they come to speak to us about the bounds of their relationship as a leasee, I think would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Carr, questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have some questions. My first question relates to the fact that on page 7 of this report, it talks about one particular industry or company, Hootsuite, being in partnership with Westbank. And I would like to know what the ownership is of these, I think there's 6 square blocks, right, in this area. If there are particular landowners, concentration of land in particular landowners, I'd like to have that reported to. Now is fine, but I'd like it at public hearing as well.
Kent Monroe, Assistant Director of Planning. We can certainly get that for you. I believe there's 21 unique property owners or in the area. I don't have the list with me now,
Right.
but we can share that with you.
Right. Yeah, thank you. The reason I raised it is because I think there are rumors going around that there are some very few landowners that own big chunks, and I would just like that to be presented at the time of public hearing, and the city, I think, as well. I'd also like an explanation of the streamlined development process, which is detailed on page 9, reducing time, cost, risk. Is it just, well, I noted later on in the report, page 18, there's no site-specific rezonings. So was that the only piece of streamlining, or are there other bits of streamlining that we are proposing?
The primary motivation to the way we're proposing this is to zone the property, which would allow businesses and enterprises in that area to come forward with development applications, essentially sort of cutting out the 9-month to 12-month zoning process that they would normally have to go through.
Right.
And with the 21 or whatever the number ends up being individual properties, that could be a lot of work. So that's
Right.
how this is being facilitated.
Right. It would be, thank you for providing that information now, and it would be good, I think, to provide that also at the time of public hearing. Because of the no rezonings, does that mean that there will be no community amenity contributions and that all of the development cost levies will be DCLs?
There's charges built into the zone to help fund amenities. We can explain all that at the public hearing.
Okay.
That would go towards daycare and other facilities and or amenities in the neighborhood.
Okay. I think that's a very important thing to place into the public realm at the time of the public hearing. And also, I did have a question specifically around the public amenity charges. On page 12, I didn't quite understand how they compare to other public amenity charges, and if you could provide perhaps some comparison to, this is a streamlined process, I wasn't quite sure exactly how it was going to work, but if there is a comparison to CACs and DCLs in other areas or adjacent areas, or something that can provide, are we getting fair value out of these?
Yeah, is there a particular area that you're interested in?
No, it was just the fact that on page 12 it talked about it detailed the public amenity charges. And these numbers of 462.85 per square meter, is this comparable to other public amenity charges is my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keeping, of course, in mind this is office use, so
Right.
we'll give you comparisons to other office areas.
That would be very useful.
Sure.
Thank you. And my final question, oh, sorry, I have two more. My second to last is around the parking that's lost. There was some spaces that were detailed on Quebec, and that the aim is 85% turnover or rotation is an ideal. If you could provide some explanation of how we are projecting that 85%, which is, I think it's 75% now, but there's a lot more business that's being projected to be developed within the area. So some sense of, it may be at 75% now, we see 85% as ideal. What would it be, what is the projection if we fill in the development as proposed under this whole policy?
Right. I would just point out that the percentages that you're quoting relate to the on-street parking.
Yes.
And new developments in this area would provide their own on-site parking as well. So we'll have transportation staff here at the public hearing to...
I'm happy to receive both bits of information. Sure. Okay. And my final question, it has been raised by individuals who have emailed us and met with some of us up to this point of referral, is around the city-owned heritage building, or the city-owned building, and if there could be some explanation from cultural services or social services around sort of the expectation of what would happen to current tenants.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Councillor Meggs, questions?
Well, mine are more high level, but it's referenced in the report in passing, but I wouldn't mind a bit more information at public hearing about the improvements in job numbers in the area generally, the whole area that was previously rezoned, and what expectations or hopes there are for increasing economic activity in the area that's subject to this hearing.
So an assessment of what's been happening in the area?
Yeah, well, you make reference
Yes.
to the impact of the 2013 changes.
Yes.
Which I think has been very positive, but I'm wondering if there's any idea of what further positive benefits would flow from this.
I see. Okay.
Okay, I think that's all for questions. Someone want to move? Referral? Councillor Deal seconder, Councillor Ball, and any discussion on this one? All those in favor? And any opposed? None opposed. It looks like we've got unanimous approval for item P3. Policy Report 3, that's the innovation economy in Mount Pleasant industrial area. So we are on to the bylaws. We've concluded on the reports that we held, and let's see, bylaws 1 through 26 and 29 and 30 are on the agenda for consideration by council. 27 and 28 have been withdrawn. So I'll ask if any councillors wish to hold any of the bylaws for debate, separate vote, or because of conflict of interest. Seeing none, I'll go through some of the details. Bylaws 21, 24, 26, and 29 are public hearing enactment bylaws, and council members who are absent from those respective hearings may only vote if they now confirm they reviewed the missed portions of meetings, which includes viewing the related video clip. And so with bylaws 21, 26, and 29, they're public hearing enactment bylaws from hearings on December the 15th. Pardon me? He is not, so we can skip that for now. Bylaw 24 is a public hearing enactment bylaw from a hearing held on April the 5th, 2016, and Councillors Carr, Deal, and Jang were absent from that hearing. Councillor Carr, have you reviewed the proceedings and will you be voting on the enactment?
No, I will not, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. And Councillor Deal?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. Okay. That's all I needed to check on, so I'll ask someone to move adoption of bylaws 1 to 26, 29, and 30. Moved by Councillor Deal, seconder, Councillor Meggs, and any discussion? All those in favor of approving the bylaws? Any opposed? None opposed? That carries unanimously. So the list of the approved bylaws can be viewed on the city's website. And we now have 3 administrative motions on the agenda. The first 2 are to be moved by Councillor Stevenson, seconded by Councillor Louis. And I'll call the question on those. All in favor, the administrative motions? Are there any opposed? Okay. Those carry unanimously. And the third administrative motion is the budget resolution. And the budget resolution was distributed with the agenda. However, we have made some changes to the recommendations. And so a different resolution is now displayed on your monitors. Madam Clerk has got that now on monitors. That's consistent with what Council approved earlier today for the 2017 budgets. So I'll ask if someone will move resolution. Councillor Meggs, Councillor Deal will second. And any discussion on the budget resolution? All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. So that piece is done, and we're on to our motions on notice. Now we have 6 motions on notice. Motion number 1 is culture, 4th pillar of sustainability, which was that is to be moved by Councillor Ball and seconded by Councillor DeGenova. We have requests to speak to this motion, so I'd ask if someone will move referral to hear from them tomorrow. Okay. Okay, Councillor DeGenova will move referral to tomorrow's committee meeting. A seconder for that. Councillor Deal. Okay. So all those in favor of referring the first motion on culture to tomorrow's committee meeting to hear from speakers? Any opposed? And that carries. So we'll bring that back tomorrow. Our second motion on notice is a request for leave of absence for Councillor Stevenson. Someone like to move that motion? Councillor Carr will move, seconder. Councillor DeGenova. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. And motion on notice number 3, action to speed refugee arrivals, that's Councillor Meggs' motion. And oh, we do have a speaker to that. I'm happy to second that while we're given it involves the federal government. Okay, Councillor Meggs will move referral to hear speakers tomorrow, and a seconder for that, Councillor Carr. All those in favor of sending that to tomorrow to hear from speakers? Any opposed? That carries. We're on to the 4th motion on notice. That's investigating DCL waivers, to be moved by Councillor Carr. And that needs a seconder. Councillor Ball is first on it there. And Councillor Carr, I will go to you to hear, you can introduce this motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. This motion obviously arose out of information that actually came forward first in a Global TV investigative piece of journalism, and was followed up swiftly with memos from the city manager and ultimately a report from the city manager. The report hadn't been placed in our hands until after I'd submitted this motion, but it doesn't change my desire to see this more detailed information provided back to us, because I think this is an issue that speaks very significantly to public confidence in our decision-making processes here at Council. And I think we want to be absolutely sure we have full public confidence in the decisions that are made, and particularly those that are made around money related to developers, waiver of those monies, not waiver of those monies. So my particular motion asked for information that I deemed was not going to be forthcoming in the report. It's of a different level of detail. But for me, we all know the situation. There was a project that was approved by council at 1396 Richards. It was not eligible for DCL waiver. It did, however, receive a DCL waiver, and we've had a report back on that. I still have questions about that. One of my questions relates to the fact that the address for that DCL waiver as contained in a DCL report was a different address than the address of the actual proposal that was approved of by council. That does raise red flags for me in the sense that if there would be anything to hide under some circumstance, changing an address and making it very hard to track the development process and search for information on the development process is one method that has come up in other places, and I think that needs to be looked into. How many of our development proposals change actual addresses? I've actually found a few in the little bit of investigating I have, and I think not tying always the same address that was approved of and that went through a public hearing and a development process, and making sure even if there's a change of address that original address stays intact as a searchable item, I think is incredibly important. I'd like to know what happens around that particular process. Secondly, we do know from the report that was given to us that there was a decision came to after council made its decision to not allow a DCL waiver on the advice of staff at public hearing and in the public report. There is a listing of individuals in the report we've received back from the city manager who have the authority to review and approve the DCL waivers, but my interest is in knowing whether any of those staff at any time or during any time period had the authority to overturn a DCL waiver on the part that would have been originally made by council. And I think that's information we want to ensure the public knows about and feels confident in. So it's really for those very specific requests that I'm seeking a further report back, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Carr. I'll just speak to this. I don't have anyone else on the queue, but glad to see this coming forward. Appreciate putting the questions forward to staff. I know staff have been working hard, led by the city manager, to get to the bottom of all this and make sure we know exactly what happened and that this doesn't happen again. Obviously, we don't want to see mistakes made like this at all. And I know our city manager and team have been working diligently, both with the internal auditing process and then having an external auditor involved to look at the development fee waivers and make sure that all that's totally above board, and we are seeing no mistakes. So obviously there was a mistake made here. I think these are important questions for staff to answer in the report back that we expect to understand exactly what happened here and make sure it doesn't happen again. So thanks, Councillor Carr, for bringing it forward, and thanks to our city manager for being on top of this and making sure we figure out exactly what happened. And any other speakers on this motion? Ready for the question? All those in favor? Any opposed? What's that? I think we can just do. Are we voting on screen? Okay. We're voting on screen. So, just waiting for Councillors Stevenson and DeGenova. Okay, 11 votes all in favor, and that's unanimous support for looking into that. So thank you, Council, for that. We have finished on that piece, and we're on to motion on notice number 5, and that's the update to special events policy. And Councillor Deal, you moved that motion. Needs a seconder. Also happy to second. Councillor Stevenson is happy to second it. Okay, I will defer. And we have a request to speak to this motion as well, so someone can move a motion. Councillor Deal will move to refer this to tomorrow to hear from the speakers at committee. What's that? Introduce it tomorrow. Councillor DeGenova seconds that. All those in favor of referring to tomorrow? Hear from speakers. Any opposed? That carries. That comes back tomorrow. And our final motion on notice is the DCL waiver independent third-party inquiry to be moved by Councillor Affleck. And Councillor DeGenova will second that. And we'll go to Councillor Affleck.
Mayor, I think the dueling motions today on the subject, but mine is slightly more broad in that while that project itself had some challenges, I think it's important that we look and have a third party that has no relationship with the city at all come to analyze not only that project but all projects that where there was a waiver in any capacity. I think it's important and concerning when a journalist uncovers something and that we are found to be lacking in certain procedures. I think it's important for the trust of the people of the city to have a third party not only analyze this project but all other projects in a similar way to ensure that everything is operating properly and efficiently and that we as a city don't have to rely on journalists to uncover the problems that we may have through our administration and staffing. It's not an offense against them. I think it's I respect the information that we have received from the city manager, but I think it's important to distance ourselves and for our staff to distance themselves from this to provide a clarity to what happened and to what may or may not have happened in other areas in the city. So looking for your support on this and hope I can get approval. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Louis.
Yes, the discovery of this situation, of course, has triggered an extensive review by staff already and articulated to us in regards to this one project, what happened to a degree, and I think a further investigation is still underway. Staff will report back once they've completed that. But obviously with this, we support understanding what happened in order to not repeat what had transpired in this one instance. Councillor Carr's motion is definitely supportable in terms of the slight difference so that we can provide additional clarity to staff as they go off and do their investigation and report back to us. But Councillor Affleck's motion, I think, stretches the bounds of what might be the issue in terms of investigation. Third party, I think, is important for the independence of that investigation to be made. But in regards to all of the similar waivers and contributions since 2008, it's a bit of a fishing expedition, I would say, when it's not proven at this point what the issue is with these others. I'm prepared, though, to support an investigation with regard to the DCL waivers and such regarding to the two programs which drove this initial this investigation, which was the STIR program and the Rental 100 program. And so I'll move an amendment to include the words relating to the STIR and Rental 100 programs and replacement of all similar contributions. And hope that focuses the attention of this third party person, focuses staff's attention on their report back, and that so that we can in turn avoid these types of situations going forward, rather than going specifically to a long and extensive review of all programs, given that there's no evidence of that.
Okay, I've just gone to an amendment queue here on your amendment to the motion. And everyone has that. Councillor Affleck, do you want to speak to the amendment?
I'll support the amendment. I think the key is
We
to
need a
get
seconder.
to...
Someone want a second?
Sorry.
Councillor Affleck will second.
Okay. Sorry, I'll support the amendment. I think it's some, detail, I suppose, that makes Councillor Louis happy, but I think it does the same job that I'm asking. I think for the most part, especially related to STIR, it goes back to around that time. So I look forward to seeing the information that comes from this. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else to the amendment? Let's vote on the amendment then. Okay, we've got unanimous support for the amendment, and that means we go back to the main motion. Anything further, Councillor Louis? Anyone else want to speak to the motion as amended? We're ready for the question. We will go to the vote on the Councillor Affleck's motion as amended by Councillor Louis. And we have 11 votes all in favor, unanimous support. Thanks, Councillor Affleck and Councillor Louis for that. So we have some work going forward on this issue, and we'll look forward to hearing back from the city manager on the next steps with an external review of all this. So that concludes our motions on notice, and we are on to the notice of motion, new business, inquiries, and other matters to finish up today. And Councillor Reimer is first.
Thanks, Mayor Robertson. I had 2 inquiries of staff and then something to share with council. So the inquiries to staff, firstly on the public hearing matter related to modular homes that was partially withdrawn from tonight's public hearing. I would appreciate staff advising on what has been withdrawn, and has it been withdrawn completely such that we could speak with residents regarding the matter, or is it under referral still?
Mr. City Manager.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor and Council, that is our intentions, but I will provide legal reference for you so you can refer to that. But it's our intention to remove those 4 sites, as I had indicated in my communication, and that we would go back and do further consultation and bring them back as a part of a new referral in the future. So you'd be able to talk to members of the community about it, but I'll get you something in writing for that.
Okay, I appreciate that. The second inquiry was in regard to reports to council. We currently routinely include if Type C advisory committees, so the statutory advisory committees, provide advice to council on a matter, so the Urban Design Panel or the Heritage Commission, that's routinely included in a report to council. However, Type A and Type B committees, so that would be Type A, the advisory to council, so Food Policy Council or Seniors Advisory or Arts and Culture Policy Council, to name a few, they are not routinely included, nor are Type B, so Chinatown Historic Area Planning or Gastown First Shaughnessy. So my question to staff is if it would be possible to include comments where the committee has taken, has considered a matter. They may or may not have taken a position, but may have some feedback and advice to council. I note of late we've had a lot of standalone motions, and I, in reflecting upon it, think that part of the challenge is it's the only current avenue available to committees to bring advice to council.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We'll look into the best way to structure that so that when a report comes, you've got the input of the impacted committees. So happy to look at how we might do that in the actual committee body structure and or council report structure. So we'll come back with some thoughts on that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Last thing, I know most of council was there, so for those that weren't, just to note, on Saturday, Human Rights Day, Mayor Robertson launched 101 days of action on discrimination and racism that will culminate in a rally on March 19th in observation of March 21st, which is the 101st day of the Days of Action, and also the International Day to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. The event was on Saturday at the main library. I wanted to give a specific shout out to some community organizations, Success, Out on Screen, and they're Out in Schools program, the Al Jamia Mosque, and Spice Radio and Hands Up Against Racism, who all provided speakers at the event. There was another dozen or so major organizations in the city, ranging from the BC Federation of Labor to faith groups to different nonprofit and community groups, women's groups like Battered Women Support Services, who all came together on very short notice to put together this extraordinary effort to really speak out about acts of discrimination and racism that we're seeing in our community. So the website is at 101days.ca. You can go there and personally sign a pledge if you weren't able to come to the launch and do that yourself. I would really encourage councillors to share that information. There will be events. I know Success had already committed to doing a public forum. All of the signatories to the initiative are committing to doing public forums. So it's an opportunity for us as councillors to really show some leadership on this important issue for many communities in our city right now. And the last things I wanted to give two thanks. One, to the Mayor's office. I know you don't have 20 staff, you have a few, and a few of them were extraordinarily helpful on short notice with already very busy schedules to help out with this. And also the BCGU who put together the entire website on 2 days' notice, and without question, they were just very happy to see the city's leadership on this. So I wanted to thank them in public here at Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Reimer, and thanks for your efforts to pull all that together and invite so many groups to be part of the 101 days of action against discrimination and racism. And I think we've got that off to a good start. Really good support in the community and some great partners who stepped up right away. So thanks to everyone involved. Councillor Affleck is next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just going back in time to a attempted motion I put forward earlier during the budget discussion. So if the clerk could bring it up for me. I'd like to put this forward as urgent business. I think that, as I said earlier, we are dealing with a crisis in the city, and I think that immediate action is needed as opposed to waiting until 2017, and also potentially finding the money in the current budget year that we may have in any one of the line items that might not have been spent. I would like to hear back from staff if that's possible, and then I would like for us to be proactive and approach the other levels of government to see if they can match that money so we can inject that fund to what staff may stipulate it. And now perhaps Councillor Jang can perhaps address what that might be. But I would say that if there are funds available, $300,000 is what I'm recommending, and then we ask the federal and provincial governments to also inject that money, perhaps Metro would as well. We can perhaps make some immediate steps to dealing with this issue in whatever way we can as a city. So I look for your support on this. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so Councillor Affleck has moved. Councillor DiGenoa has seconded. I think certainly it does, given the issue around fentanyl and overdose deaths, certainly is urgent. That I think we consider this matter as council. And I've got a number of speakers to the motion. Councillor Jang first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and appreciate Councillor Affleck's willingness to address an issue. A couple questions first to staff, and I think before I can consider this. First of all, it says $300,000 contingent upon federal and provincial government funding. So there's no money unless the feds and the province come up with matching funds. So how does that help the immediate crisis? Because they could say no, and there's nothing there. Secondly, I would like to know, I know our staff, and city manager can maybe talk about this, talk about how we've already been spending a lot of extra money out of contingencies and other budgets for things like overtime and other responses. So I'm hard pressed to see how this money, which is contingent upon something else, which is contingent upon something, will actually lead to any help. And that was the whole point of the earlier debate, is we need something now. And if you're going to wait until two other levels of government come up with matching funds, well, people are dying now. And I can't see how this can help.
But I would really appreciate from our staff an outline of other funds we've been spending either out of contingency or existing budgets to deal with the crisis, such as overtime. I know we're spending a lot there. Thank you.
Mr. Johnston?
Or Mr. Mayor and Council, if I interpreted the question, what are we doing right now to address this? The main thing is overtime for fire out of Hall 2, and of course park rangers and others. I don't have the dollar figure right now, but we're reallocating resources within those departments to address the current pressures, and that's ongoing.
The other issue I have with this is it talks about a one-time amount. And of course, that presupposes that the fentanyl crisis will abate anytime soon. We are in an upward trend at the moment. You know, the last stat was 622. The coroner's office says the morgue is full, and we are looking at over 700 by the end of the year. So one-time funding doesn't really address a health issue. This is the problem I've always had with folks trying to do health, is the fact that they're simply reacting to an emergency. When we need long-term stable funding, we need addiction care on demand. We need other types of therapies, such as drug substitution therapies, which are far, far more effective and have worked in other jurisdictions, particularly in Zurich, Hamburg, and Switzerland, and one other place. And so $300,000, which is contingent on something, really doesn't do much today, despite Councillor Affleck's, which I acknowledge is trying to help. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor DiGenova.
Thank you very much. As I am part Swiss, I'll just mention that Zurich is in Switzerland. It's not its own country. We were listing countries here. I very much support this. In fact, I see this $300,000 and finding this within our budget, as Councillor Affleck is looking within, because I think we're all still seeing the emails come in. I mean, every second email I have right here is against this 0.5% tax increase. And why do we have so many emails? Because there was not proper consultation. So I'm wondering if this is such a concern of Councillor Jang and others, why this wasn't brought forward 8 months ago. I mean, Councillor Jang often talks about how, has talked about for months what a crisis this is. Then why did we not bring this into the budget sooner and give people the chance to consult on it? I think that Councillor Affleck has taken a different way of addressing the crisis and not asking the taxpayers to take on that burden. That being said, the $300,000 that we would be contributing. I mean, we spent $303,000 total to oppose the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And I mean, that didn't go so well for us. So I think that when we look at, advertisements in papers in Ontario, it's not money that's being spent here. If we weigh that versus people who are vulnerable down on the downtown east side who are dying, people who are using drugs recreationally and aren't aware of what fentanyl could be in or where it could be found. And it's not just fentanyl, it's an opioid crisis. I think that before we even had fentanyl, we had issues in the downtown east side. And for Councillor Affleck, I thank him for bringing this forward. That being said, Councillor Jang always talks about solutions. Well, in the Naomi trial and many other harm reduction strategies, I haven't seen motions come forward to bring the Naomi trial back to try and work with other levels of governments to do things like that. I mean, it's a lot of talk, but where are we moving that forward? So we can spend $303,000 of taxpayers' money to post something in newspapers and on Facebook, but we can't take care of our own vulnerable residents in the downtown east side. The NPA, and I'm very proud of this, brought forward under Mayor Philip Owen the 4 pillars drug strategy. And it seems to me that Vision Vancouver is using a one-legged stool called reaction. And instead, let's address this. Let's work with our provincial partners. And it's been said by other councillors here that, we can't wait. Well, we couldn't wait for a senior center. However, Councillor Louie proposed that we should do a third. And I think Councillor Affleck's proposing the same thing. And yesterday, the federal government said they are making this a priority. So if this council wants to leave $300,000 $100,000 from each of the other two levels of government on the table, that's their choice, but I don't see that as fiscally responsible. So I will be supporting Councillor Affleck's motion. I thank him for bringing it forward, and I think that it certainly does support the four-pillar strategy. Thank you.
Next up, Councillor Carr.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I have, first of all, thank you to Councillor Affleck for bringing it forward. It deals with this year's budget as opposed to next year's budget, and I'm very pleased that we did deal with next year's budget during our budget discussion earlier today. However, I'm going to propose an amendment. Sorry, I don't have the actual text of his amendment in front of me to do that, but I'm hopeful that you can pick this up, Madam City Clerk. But my amendment is to endeavor, after the words to endeavor, to find take out a one-time amount totaling $300,000 to just replace that with funds from the existing 2016 budget to deal with Vancouver's fentanyl crisis. Well, there's a bit of there's some technical errors in there logistically, but anyway, it's two, and the is not needed in front of Vancouver either. To deal with Vancouver's fentanyl crisis, and take out the words contingent on and replace those with and request that federal and provincial governments each match the city's funds and take out the rest. Great. So that would at least provide for some avenue right away. I totally agree with everyone and the discussion. This is an urgent situation. We're dealing with next year, but perhaps there are some funds left over this year or that haven't been spent and that may be possible. I think that we are dealing with next year's funds well. If there is an opportunity this year, I'd be supportive of it.
Okay, we're going to go to
Mayor? May I?
Mr. City Manager, before I go to the
Sorry, just
amendments.
looking for clarification here, because the next scheduled meeting is tomorrow, and it's 3 o'clock now. I guess I'm just trying to understand what kind of proposal and detail you'd be looking for by tomorrow morning. So I guess I'm just raising that as a question.
Yes, we do. It would, however, those meetings are for continuation of either today's meeting or tomorrow's meeting or continuation of public hearing. They're not, so it would have to be in addition, like if it was to the next council meeting, it would have to be a continuation of, say, the standing committee tomorrow. That it would have to be an extension of that meeting.
Next week.
To next week.
So there is a possibility that the report could come to us next week.
There should council desire for that, there is time booked.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Louis, to the amendment.
I appreciate Councillor Carr's efforts to find a solution to addressing this particular matter. There are issues, the issue of downloading has been well canvassed today. Even the motion put forward by Councillor Affleck seems to accept a level of downloading, at least a third of that specific to this. And so contrary to what has been said by the Nonpartisan Association, that they are against downloading, they've accepted it. So at least some of you have accepted downloading on housing and childcare. And here it is that you're accepting a third of the cost. My preference is that it's not be matching funding. I believe that this issue is primarily a health issue that is dealt with at the provincial and federal levels rather than the city. We are in reaction mode because we are forced into reaction mode. And so this concept of matching does, in fact, entrench this concept that we would be accepting of downloading. And so this is, contrary to exactly what the MPA were talking about just a few hours ago as we were debating the ongoing budget. We have a plan. If we require extra funding within the 2016 budget, I expect that the city manager will let us know, and whether or not, as described as city manager, it's primarily overtime for our firefighters, and we will find it within the budget to deal with these health crises that we find on our streets. To put up a motion because perhaps he was challenged to do so rather than asking where a motion was, but have it come on the floor in this haphazard fashion, I think is doing us a disservice to this stepped approach that we've designed with staff in order to address this crisis that we find on our streets.
Okay, Councillor Stevenson to the amendment.
Thanks. Well, actually, I really appreciate the motion. I think that Councillor Affleck's heart is in the right place on this one, and he is trying to deal with the immediate crisis and looking for money out of 2016 rather than just move into 2017. I actually was going to amend this myself and just leave in the 300 for us and end of that crisis and not have it contingent upon. I'm not really concerned about the contingent part, and if 300,000 is something that we can do, I think the crisis is immediate. We need to look at it. So I was going to ask the city manager about. I can't wait for a second. I was going to ask the city manager. I don't know if you heard what I was saying then, but I was saying that I was open to the suggestion of 300,000 in the original and not necessarily concerned about the contingent, but hoping they would come along themselves. But is 300,000 a possibility out of this year's budget? Can we find that? Is it? I mean, rather than send you back and search and, as this motion says, endeavor to find blah blah blah. Could we look at that? And if so,
I'm a little bit on the spot to answer what we can find in the budget and even how we would recommend allocating it for the remainder of the year. Maybe if there's a desire to provide immediate relief and support, maybe you could frame it in a way that up to $300,000 could be reallocated to support urgent needs as determined by the city manager, so that gives us the flexibility in the changing conditions over the next 2 weeks that we can be nimble and allocate additional resources for overtime or the other elements that we need without us having to, in just a few hours, put together a proposal and not know whether that's on the mark. So that would be, I think that would provide us with the flexibility and the relief that we might need to particular parts of our organization, but it would put it within a box so that we're not needing to try to on the fly put together a specific proposal. So that would be that's one way that we could address the intention behind this without us coming forward in short notice with recommendations that may be not needed or that because I don't know whether it's 300,000, maybe it's 50. I mean, it's just we haven't done that work given that this has just come up right now. So
okay,
that would be one way.
That's certainly suitable from my point of view, and I think it meets the intention of Councillor Affleck that something immediate is done, but I'll let him deal with that.
Well, we can't have we already have an amendment to the amendment. Are we? We are on amendment 2, and that's language that Councillor Carr amended to Councillor Affleck's original motion. Just so I appreciate that. There's no withdraw. There's a Council, it's before council now, so we will need to deal with this one way or the other, and then we could come back to different language. So I'll just go through. Councillor Affleck, did you have anything further to this amendment?
Well, I'm a bit lost. It was the city manager helping Councillor Stevenson write a motion or amendment. I wasn't quite sure what was going on there. Or do you have, was there an attempt for an amendment to an amendment, or is that not happening? That's not happening? Debate this. Well, I think you know, I feel that what Councillor Carr has done is watered down this clear motion with a direct goal to staff and a challenge to the provincial and federal governments. I think what she's done here is created a milk toast. It's really not worth much at all. It's providing no goal at all, and they could come back with the $50 to us and say that's all we have. I think that we need to, as we talked earlier, put up the challenge that we all are in this together. This is a crisis, as I've said. You all keep saying this is a crisis. This is a crisis today. It's not a crisis next year. It's a crisis now. And it might be a crisis next year, but let's deal with it now. Is there a way to find the funds in our current budget? That was the intent of my motion. It was a challenge to the provincial and federal governments to also find the funds and see if we can come up with some funds to deal with this issue and this crisis in our city right now. I find it hypocritical that Councillor Carr has amended it to some kind of nebulous, redundant motion, and that we have Councillor Jang speaking against dealing with an issue right now. We've already approved the budget. You have your money, your $3.5 million for next year and forever, for that matter, because it's embedded in the budget now. You have your money to play around with however you like, Councillor Jang, but we have to deal with this crisis today. I'm asking, and I'm very disappointed in Councillor Carr to amend my motion to something that really is quite meaningless, and that we don't deal with this now and ask our staff to come back as they can next week, because we have that meeting set, and tell us and give us advice on what we can do so that Vancouver can deal with this with their partners at the federal and provincial level. So I won't support this amendment because I don't think it does what I intended my motion to do.
Okay, Councillor Meggs to this amendment.
Well, I think the amendment's trying to find a solution to a problem that, in a constructive way. I mean, the problem for some people may be that they voted against a practical matter in next year's budget and now wish to appear to be fighting harder than ever this year. But the outcome that's proposed here reminds me very much of the old Vancouver agreement, where a certain amount of resources were available at the city level, and based on agreement on suitable partnerships with the province and with the city, we participated, and that wasn't considered wasteful or anything. It was leveraging the money, and we do that all the time, of course. I don't know, it sounds like the city manager at this point can't tell us what capacity there is in the remaining 3 weeks to find a small sum that could be allocated for that purpose. But my assumption has been that at any point that the city manager or the staff feel it's relevant to come forward and propose a partnership, they will do so. And so, I would just end this way. We have heard from people who came during our budget process how hard the city is fighting this crisis today. I think in partnership with senior levels of government where they're available to partner. And that's been done within the current amount of resources. The city manager and the fire chief and others have explained how that's been done. I think that will continue in the short haul, especially given council's decision an hour or so ago on the overall budget. There's a strong signal to staff there that we would support that. It seems to me that if overnight the city manager is able to identify some reserve of some sort that he thinks would be suitable for this, I have no issue with him identifying that that's the case, and later we may find that he's bringing forward a proposal that's matched by other levels of government. I think that's his job. So I'm not sure that it's that big a problem. I could see the arguments both ways, but if what we're trying to do here is make it appear that some people who opposed an important resource decision for next year are actually very militant this year, I don't know if a vote of this council will establish that in the public's mind or not.
Councillor DiGenova, to the amendment.
To the amendment, I think that this unfortunately is leaving money on the table. And I heard from the Vision Vancouver government that with a new federal government, we would be able to go and ask for more money, and we'd be able to see, you know, all of our problems solved, homelessness, and I've never seen a tax increase proposed for that. And it seems that that's a promise that wasn't kept. So here we are again, and I think that Councillor Affleck has brought forward a way to deal with this urgently. I mean, property taxes really, they aren't due until February, so the tax increase, I mean, if we look at the next tax increase for the next tax cycle, Councillor Affleck's looking at dealing with this more urgently than anyone else in this room by looking for this money, but also in challenging the provincial and the federal governments. And I think that yesterday the federal government signaled that they did want to work with municipalities and make a difference on this, and the provincial government as well, especially if Councillor Meggs has talked about, you know, the ambulance paramedics, and I'm not sure. It did say in their letter that they did not support the tax. They did not support it being used for the purposes that were laid out. That being said, you know, we were able to just find $303,000 in the budget to place, you know, some of that went towards Facebook ads and newspaper advertisements. This is going to go towards an urgent crisis. So for those people who voted for the tax, to not vote for this is saying that you don't want to deal with this urgently, in my opinion. And I think that really one of the most heartfelt moments was when a Vision Vancouver mayor and an NPA mayor came together and said that they both supported the 4 Pillars drug strategy. And I think that this really does support that. And it brings in other levels of government also. It opens up more conversation on what we can do together. And I'd like to see our mayor and all of our councillors reach out to the appropriate ministers in the appropriate portfolios when it comes to housing and health to deal with this crisis. So I unfortunately cannot support Councillor Crow's amendment because I feel that it leaves money on the table and it sends a message to the provincial and federal governments that we really, you know, we don't want your money, and instead we're going to put petty politics in the way of vulnerable people who are dying every day, as Councillor Reimer said, and I agree, from not only fentanyl, from the opioid crisis. So for that reason, I can't support the amendment. I would support the motion as it was, and I was a little concerned by policy on the fly here as well. I'm still not sure what Councillor Stevenson's proposing, but I suppose we will see how that goes. Thanks.
Yeah, just noting that this wasn't a motion brought by Councillor Affleck, and I don't think on the fly is appropriate when we're considering an urgent motion here. Just caution that language. Councillor Stevenson is next. Passing. Councillor Reimer on the amendment.
Sure, Mayor Robertson. I've had to reread, I mean, it's not many words. I've had to reread it many times to try and square it with the reality that Councillor Affleck and DeGenova are trying to paint for us. The correct title for this motion is Let's Make a Deal on the Fentanyl Crisis, not immediate funding. The only way funding under the original motion would be provided from the city is if other levels of government gave it. This isn't a game show. There were 6,000 overdoses in the city of Vancouver this year. 6,000. We are so incredibly fortunate. The death toll is not higher, and it's only because of the work of frontline workers and because city staff have figured out how to get them the resources they needed within the existing crisis. It is very, very challenging to watch people sit here and play politics with this. People need money at the front lines. Councillor Carr's amendments propose that reality. I am willing to support those, not turning this into a politicized game show the way that Councillor Affleck's motion does.
And Councillor Louis.
Well, having heard the debate, I still have issues with the word match. I don't believe it's appropriate that we just request a matching amount of funding from the provincial or federal governments. I'm going to propose an amendment to the amendment to hopefully address that, to at least match, which will give us a bit of more flexibility on that. But be clear that my expectation from both the federal and provincial government is to far exceed what we may put towards addressing this crisis, and for them to step up significantly in that direction. Otherwise, it really is a big challenge that cannot be met by the city. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So Councillor Liu, you've added, you've switched each for at least. And
Sorry, federal government, at the government, at least match. Yeah, at least. Taking the each. Yeah, at least Vancouver. So just change the words to federal and provincial governments at least match the city of Vancouver's expenditures in relation to the fentanyl crisis. Striking the word funds.
yeah. Third line, there's an extra the before Vancouver. Councillor Louis, did you want to deal with the staff report back to next council meeting? I think Councillor Carr was looking at amending that, given there's no council meeting with an agenda currently.
The city manager then? That council approve the city manager. Council approved that.
The city manager allocating existing funds from the existing 2016 budget. Council approved the city manager.
To expend. To expend. Yes. Direct the city manager to expend necessary funds. No. Council direct the city manager to expend necessary funding striking the words to endeavor to find and funds at the end of that other note to good. Striking that word funds, yeah. I think there we have it. Now that really is on the fly.
So we're going to, yeah, we're in an amendment queue on Councillor Louis' amendment to the amendment. The council direct the city manager to expend necessary funding from the existing 2016 budget to deal with Vancouver's fentanyl crisis and request that federal and provincial governments at least match the city of Vancouver's expenditures in relation to the fentanyl crisis.
There's a fund that's right at the bottom that hasn't been struck.
Okay. And Councillor Louis moves that amendment. I'm happy to second that. Okay. Want to speak to it any further?
Sorry. It is council, isn't it? I'll just say that what I heard from council and councillors is that there's some urgency to this. This was moved originally as an emergency motion. This will be that emergency motion, that we are in fact allowing for the expenditure of additional funds as identified by the city manager into areas of necessary concern to deal with this fentanyl crisis. It does not hamper the city manager's ability to expend these funds by making it contingent on provincial and federal monies that may or may not come available in a timely fashion. This is immediate action by the city as necessary and authorized by council. And so if there's any question about the priority and our willingness to act, this gives you that clarity. There's no secondary necessary component of authority that is necessary because the provincial and federal governments have not been able to react in a timely fashion. And given the season, I expect both the provincial and the federal government will be slow in responding to another city's request, even if it is the city of Vancouver, and parsing out perhaps $300,000. This makes it very clear that we are expecting them to contribute and continue to contribute, and takes immediate action by authorizing the city manager to do so.
Thanks, Councillor Louis, and Councillor Affleck for the motion.
You know, we have a job here, you guys. You know, our role is to govern this city. I'm not willing to write a blank check to the city manager at this point in time. My intention was to provide instruction to staff to come back with some information so that we could make an informed opinion and decision based on that information. I think that if you're willing to give away your authority, Councillor Louis, in this chamber, then why don't you just resign from council and become a public citizen or become staff if that's where you think all the authority lies. Our job as councillors and the mayor in the city is to oversee, the number one priority is to oversee the finances of our city. To the amendment, an amendment to the motion that I put forward has absolutely nothing with any direction at all in it. It provides the city manager with no clarity at all of what he is supposed to achieve, and it provides no transparency to what we should be receiving as the people who govern our city. That is not appropriate at all. I cannot support that. As much as I want to help immediately the crisis that we have in Vancouver, this Frankenstein's child of a motion is not appropriate for us in this chamber to make a decision on today. Absolutely not. Either you decide on the number, you give clear direction to staff to come back to us with concrete examples and ideas of what we can do, then that's what we should be doing. We should not be providing no direction in any specific way to the city manager to go away at Christmas and go on a Christmas shopping spree on wherever he wants. This is not appropriate. This is not appropriate at all what this motion has become.
Councillor DiGenova.
This motion, unfortunately, I know that this is not what Councillor Affleck originally put forward. And the sentiment, I believed, was to get the other levels of government on board, and I don't see us doing that. I don't see us encouraging it. I've heard other councillors, not strongly enough. I think that it was worded much more strongly as Councillor Affleck had it worded, and it encouraged us to work with other levels of government. I can't comment on that. I'm not the one jet setting off to Ottawa or to see other levels of government all the time like other people here are. But that being said, I keep in touch with other levels of government via email or when I see them at events. I certainly do plead for Vancouver, especially our downtown east side, when it comes to housing. I know Councillor Carr and I were both down there. You know, you put your politics aside for both, for different things, especially when it comes to the provincial government. That being said, when it comes right down to it, I happen to agree with Councillor Affleck. I think this motion has been changed. I think this new slush fund is more slushy than the slush outside right now. I mean, it just seems to me that that there's no action as to what's going to happen with this funding, and I didn't see line items that came forward. Councillor Meggs said that people, when they came to the consultation, mentioned that we're in a crisis. They didn't have time to comment on this because it was brought forward 48 hours ahead of time. If so many councillors here are experts in this, and some have said that they are, then they should have brought this forward before we went out to consult on the budget. And that is my opinion. And now we're asking the taxpayer to foot that bill whereas Councillor Affleck is looking for immediate action, something that could come today and really that supports the 4-pillar drug strategy. So if you don't support the motion as Councillor Affleck put it forward, then it's shutting the door to funding from the federal government and the provincial government as I see it, and it's really putting a Band-Aid on this process. The other issue here is Councillor Affleck's addressed is we need to not only bring other levels of government in, but we need to address the crisis. The crisis also includes mental health. It includes housing. So using the term fentanyl and only fentanyl, I know Councillor Affleck did that because that's what came in the memo to us, but I think that there's a larger crisis here. And unfortunately, it's only gotten bigger under this government. That's what I've seen. I've seen the numbers rise and go up. That's a fact. And unfortunately, I won't be able to support this as it's written currently. And it's sad to me that we can spend $303,000, a lot of that money on advertisements in other provinces, but you know there isn't a willingness to work with other levels of government. We'll take a newspaper advertisement all the way out to Ottawa to get the federal government's attention, but we can't send them a letter to ask them for this money. Seems kind of hypocritical to me.
Councillor Carr.
Well, frankly, I'm astonished. I am having a very hard time understanding the rationale behind the motion that was put forward by Councillor Affleck and the protests of Councillor Affleck and Councillor DeGenova to changes that would actually achieve more what Councillor Affleck had originally intended to say. It seems like just bait and switch going on for the last hour. Number one, the intent of Councillor Affleck's motion was to have an immediate response to a crisis. His words, it has to help immediately. His word, this motion that has been amended won't help immediately. Well, let me be very clear. The original motion put forward by Councillor Affleck would not have helped immediately because it was contingent upon funding from the federal and provincial governments. I don't know how many times Councillor Affleck has gone to Ottawa or to the province to request money. It took 52 trips for me to get $11 million out of the federal government one time. You don't get it immediately. Councillor Luby, I'm sure, can tell you about how often you have to speak over and over around an issue to finally get some funding on it. It's not going to happen before year end. We've got next year taken care of at least through the budget motions we made this morning. This was supposed to be about immediate action. That's why I made the changes so it would not be contingent upon the federal and provincial governments. However, it does not remove the request to the federal and provincial governments, unlike what Councillor DeGenova just said. Oh, we're not going to ask them? Well, where in this motion does it say we're not going to ask them? Let me repeat. Requests that federal and provincial governments at least match the City of Vancouver's expenditures. There is indeed a request and a movement forward on that front. Meanwhile, we are going to give some authority to our city manager to find funds, whatever funds might be available, to act immediately. There can be nothing more clear then this is an immediate response to act immediately to the current crisis using this year's budget funds. That's exactly what this motion is about, and that we will also work with the federal and the provincial governments in terms of providing further requests. Now, do I trust the city manager to not treat this as a slush fund, but indeed to treat this to apply measures to the immediate response needed around the fentanyl crisis? I absolutely do trust the city manager on this. It was he who sent us a memo detailing well, actually, he forwarded it. It was Ms. Impey's motion, I mean, letter or email to us. But the details are clear. I would expect that those varied options, everything from frontline workers to mental health support to, overtime payments of staff, that these would be to support workers in the frontline agencies, that these would all be the measures that we would be pursuing with an immediate and urgent action using this year's funds. I cannot understand where the arguments are coming from on this. It does not seem to me logical in terms of the interpretations. I think that this is exactly the right motion, and so I am going to be supporting it.
Thanks, Councillor Carr. Councillor Stevenson?
You took every word right out of my mouth.
Oh, point of order. Oh, she didn't put it in. She put it out.
I started off earlier with this, giving credit to Councillor Affleck, because I really felt that he was wanting to try to deal with this immediate problem, this immediate crisis, and was willing even to put $300,000 on the table. The problem that I had with it merely was contingent. This motion solves those problems. And I kind of get the sense that Councillor Affleck, I don't know, doesn't trust the city manager, thinks he go on a spending spree. I mean, this is nonsense. This is our city manager. This is not some used car salesman we're giving over a huge check to. He reports to us, and he does the best for us, for the whole council. And he's very concerned about this crisis. And here we're giving an opportunity, unbeknownst to him, we're coming forward and saying, we agree, or Councillor Affleck said, we agree there is a crisis and we should be doing something about that out of this budget now, rather than wait for the budget that Councillor Affleck voted against, where we have money for next year. So I'm also concerned. I heard the MPA said this was a partisan argument was happening here, and I felt it was above that, at least up until now. And I also, along with Councillor Carr, are totally confused. She said she doesn't understand the logic. The reason Councillor Carr doesn't understand the logic from the MPA is because there is no logical. It is illogical. So I find this, if you like, a really good piece of work that's come together with everyone with the best intentions, trying to find some funds and have it happen fairly rapidly. And we've only got 2 weeks to the end of December anyway. It's not very easy to spend enormous amounts of money in this short time, but it's an escape valve, I think, for the staff for this period that's coming up to Christmas, when we know that the situation is going to get even worse. So I'm happy to vote in favor of this.
Okay, thank you. And back to Councillor Louis, closing comments.
Mr. Mayor, I've listened intently to the debate. I hear some concerns in regards to the expenditures and perhaps the open-endedness of the authority vested to the city manager. I've had a brief side conversation with the city manager. There is only 2 weeks left in the year. That the proposition that we would spend exorbitant amounts of money during that period of time is highly unlikely, to say the very least. But despite this, I think it might be appropriate to add the words up to $300,000 to put the limit as required. The protestations of Councillor Affleck on the open-endedness, I think, are truly held. In order to satisfy him and to perhaps entice him to vote for this, those words would put a cap on that. And if he truly does, and the MPA truly does believe that a reaction and by the city is appropriate, then this amendment should satisfy their component. Now, I will say that it is very rich of Councillor DiGenova to, on one hand, say, I've been meeting with provincial ministers at UBCM and particular ministers, and then at the other side of her mouth says jet setting off to Ottawa for individuals of council. And I'll just admit that I've been to Ottawa many times, but when I go to Ottawa many times, I'm meeting with the Minister of Finance, I'm meeting with the Minister of Infrastructure, I'm meeting with the Minister in charge of Housing, I'm meeting with the Prime Minister. And through those conversations, we've been able to achieve at least what was in phase 1 of the infrastructure, and there will be more money under phase 2, and which was significantly more than what was available under the previous Conservative government, which apparently you're more supportive of. So I have issues with the concept.
Councillor DiGenova, you have a point of order?
5.2, Section F, Councillor Louis just implied that he knew my federal political alignment or who I supported, and I never said I supported one government over another government. I like to work with all governments.
That is not a point of order. I'll go back to Councillor Louis.
Thank you. And so these meetings go well beyond the letter that Councillor DiGenova says we aren't sending. In fact, the motion is absolutely clear that we would be requesting that the federal and provincial governments at least match the cities of Vancouver's expenditures. And I'd expect that it would go beyond a letter, in fact, but conversations that we would have in order to make that happen. And so this characterization that we are not taking action, that we are not able to even write a letter, is again a manufacturing of a falsehood that does not in fact exist, which seems to be the pattern for some councillors when we speak to particular issues, collating issues that are absolutely unrelated to the issue that's before us, but they seem not to have the ability to control themselves and conflating these types of issues together. Mr. Mayor, just to add those words, thank you.
Okay. That's final comments on the amendment, so we're going to vote on Councillor Louis' amendment. No, that's he had the last word on his amendment, and we'll come back. We will come back to your amendment, or to your original motion, if depending on what happens with this amendment. So Councillor Louis has the final word on his amendment. Councillor DiGenova, you have a point of order?
Mr. Mayor, respectfully, Councillor Louis added wording to the amendment after some of us had the opportunity to speak on it, thus changing his amendment. I think that's what Councillor Affleck was just trying to point out, and thus, in the process, that didn't allow us to speak to the full amendment. So I think that we would need another round on the amendment as amended by Councillor Louis.
Okay, I appreciate your opinion on it. As chair, I'm not going to go for another whole round of speaking on this. I think everyone knows what's on the table. Councillor Louis, after consulting with the city manager, just clarified a cap in terms of spending, which was a concern raised through debate. So the motion is, the amendment is very clear, and I'm going to call the question on it. And we'll go to the voting screen for the amendment moved by Councillor Louis that everyone has in front of them. The council direct the city manager to expend necessary funding of up to $300,000 from the existing 2016 budget to deal with Vancouver's fentanyl crisis, and request the federal and provincial governments at least match the city of Vancouver's expenditures in relation to the fentanyl crisis. And we have just Councillor Ball we're waiting on. Okay, we have 7 in favor and 3 in opposition. Ball, Affleck, DiGenova opposed. That amendment carries, and we are going back to tracing our way back. That's the amendment to the amendment, wasn't it? So we go back to Councillor Carr's amendment as amended.
Be amended by Councillor Lewis?
Yes,
correct.
That's the new language. So I'll call the question on that. It's basically repeating what we just voted on. Okay, everyone please vote. Okay, again, 8 votes in favor this time, 3 in opposition. Ball, Affleck, and DiGenova opposed to the amendment. And that means the amendment has carried, and we go back to the original motion now as amended. And For some reason, I have Councillor Affleck. I think Councillor Carr was the last to speak there. Yeah, this is the one we started in. So Councillor Affleck, it's back to you to. Okay, Councillor Ball. Okay, and Councillor Stevenson.
Well, I'll be voting in favor. I actually want to thank Councillor Affleck for bringing this forward, even though it's not the motion now that he wanted. But I think it was important that he raised this issue of this year, and that we've had this important discussion about the crisis and about the immediate need for funds. And if it hadn't been for Councillor Ball bringing that forward, those funds wouldn't be available immediately. So I'm appreciative of it.
Okay, and before we go to Councillor Affleck, I'll just voice my support for what we've ended up with in front of us. I think what we've landed on here, I hope that we'll have unanimous support for enabling the city manager to put urgent funding into the fentanyl overdose crisis on our streets in this year. I think that was the original intent of the urgent motion brought forward by Councillor Affleck. We obviously would like to see funding from the provincial and federal government that exceeds what we put on the table here in these coming weeks. But I think the whole purpose here is to make sure the city manager has some resources to work with in these next couple of weeks prior to the 2017 budget increased funding that we approved earlier today to take action on any support that's needed for overtime, first responders in particular that need support through what will inevitably be a tough and busy holiday season given the weather and given how intense the overdose rate is right now in our streets. So I'm thankful to see that we'll have council support to take urgent action here and make sure that there's some money to support our first responders in these next couple of weeks. And again, that will dovetail with the funding that we've approved going into 2017 with. Councillor Affleck, final comment?
Well, my biggest concern, while I appreciate the addition of the funding number to it, what worries me most of all is the lack of transparency and the lack of reporting to council. And I'm wondering if we can just add a sentence at the end to state something to the effect of that staff report back to council via memo in advance of any expenditures. Or if I get the will of the council that's to provide some transparency to us before. I want some information before we spend $300,000 from staff. I want to know where that money's going, how it's being spent, what budget line item it's being taken from. There's no detail here of where that money's coming from. You're providing the city manager the ability to spend $300,000 without any direction. All I'm asking is that staff provide us with some sort of memo on where they plan to spend this additional funds and if they succeeded at receiving any funds from the other levels of government. I don't think that's over asking. I'm not sure if it's where we're at as far as an amendment possibility to my own motion now, I suppose, because it's an amended motion. But since it's my motion, I suppose I can add it. Can I not? Can I get some clarity on that?
No, the motion is council's motion at this point. So it's if you want to move a new amendment, that's at your discretion. This is a city.
It's hard to describe, actually.
This is a city council. Sir, you're interrupting a city council meeting. Yeah, council. So, Councillor Affleck, did you want to make an amendment?
I'd just like to make an amendment to at the end that staff report back to council via memo with details of any expenditure and any successful matching funds achieved that may have been achieved. That may have been achieved. Staff report to Council Environment with details, well, prior to any expenditure. Yeah, yeah. The details of any, environment with details of any expenditure prior, well, staff report back to Council Environment memo in advance of any expenditure after expenditure with any details and successful matching funds from other levels of government. Or take out one of those any's. Take out the second any, maybe a lot of any's in there. Or the third, or the fourth. So what I'm asking is a simple, transparent details from staff so that we know what's going on, where this money is going, and I think that's best practices as much as we can, given that we are going on a break, and that we can then provide clarity to the staff, to the city manager to get to work on this and come back to us with any details or success on those matching funds.
Okay, we've got another amendment before council. That's now seconded. And Councillor Louis to the amendment.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, if it's not clear now, it should be very clear that there is no emergency, as stated when we started this conversation on this fentanyl crisis according to the NPA, that there is no immediate action, there's no emergency to be dealt with, but rather we should wait. We should wait until we get successful matching funds from the federal and provincial government.
There's no point of order. I'm listening to the speaker. Thank you. Councillor Louis has the floor.
The matter has been well debated. The question is whether or not we spend additional funding if necessary, and I would say the vast majority of council, excepting the MPA, believe that we should do so. There are limits on that funding, and we have tasked the city manager to look carefully at what resources are necessary and what could possibly be expended in this remaining 2 weeks of 2016. This amendment makes it clear that in advance of any further expenditure, details and successful funding needs to be yielded from the provincial and federal government, which means no expenditure, which essentially was the original motion that Councillor Affleck moved as well, is that contingent upon. And so when they describe it as an emergency and wanting to take immediate action, that doesn't appear ever to have been the case. And both in the original motion and in this final amendment, hopefully final amendment, that no action is necessary, no action should be taken. This premise that monies from 2016 should be spent isn't really going to be spent, according to both the original motion and the amendment put forward now by the MPA and Councillor Affleck. And so I'm absolutely against. I believe that there is a necessity, and I task the city manager to find the opportunities, if there are any, to help people that are dying.
This is not out of order because, in fact, This now says, in advance of any expenditure with details and successful matching from other levels. And in our previous, we have said that it doesn't have to have matching levels from government. So now he's asking that there be a memo in advance of expenditures linking to matching funds. But we've already decided that they're not linked.
Yeah, I think it could be interpreted either way, whether or not successful matching funds are contingent. I was interpreting it the other way, that the report was just whether there are matching funds. I think we'll have to assume that, because you're right. If it was contingent, we've already disposed of that as content in this motion. Okay. Thanks, Councillor Affleck. Councillor Reimer, to the amendment.
Yeah, it feels like we've been debating this for a long time, but I'm not really sure how long it's been, but it feels like in the span of that time, we've gone from immediate action on fentanyl crisis to actually halting any action on the fentanyl crisis with this amendment. The town hall meeting that we had earlier this week, I know that Councillor Affleck and DeGenova were not available to attend it, but for the hundreds of people that were there, it was a very critical event that came as a result of expenditures that under this amendment would not have been possible.
Councillor DeGenova, I don't think you were, there was nothing to suggest that. Councillor Reimer, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. So I'm glad to hear that you were able to see some of it, because then maybe you would understand the value of such a town hall that under this amendment would not have been possible, because we would have had to wait for a memo for the expenditure and presumably some kind of opt-in, opt-out approval of council for it. We have we had 735 call-outs from Fire Hall 2 due to overdoses in the month of November alone. That cost extra money that the city manager and the city has been finding from reallocations in the budget. We have increased public realm cleanliness costs because of increased discarded needles. All of that would be stopped as a result of this amendment. So we have a routine procedure at the city that we get quarterly reports on financial expenditures after they've been made within the authority of the different department heads. So this would actually strip that pre-existing procedure for no reason that I can tell other than some false premise that this would somehow facilitate immediate action, which it would not. So I think the Orwellian nature of this debate has created a lot of confusion around what's actually going on. What's going on is that there's a crisis. Councillor Louie and Carr have proposed putting money on the table today to additionally deal with the crisis in addition to what the city manager and different departments have been able to do. I support that course of action. This attempt to try and stall it with saying one thing and then moving actions to the contrary is just, it defies any logic or reason. If there weren't lives in the balance here, it'd just simply be funny, but the reality is that there are thousands of overdoses and over 100 people dead as a result of those overdoses. So for us to be sitting here having a political discussion while that's happening, it's hard to find an adjective to support the continuation of it.
Councillor Stevenson, to the amendment.
Just quickly, Councillor Affleck, I really feel like you're just digging yourself in deeper here, and whereas you started off with what I thought was a really important and heartfelt motion to deal with this crisis, you're now trying to tie everybody up in knots. And I don't think even in your first motion that you asked for a memo back in advance of any expenditures. You just said $300,000 and tie it into the other levels of government. And now you've said that you're not tying it in here to other levels of government. You just told the mayor that was your interpretation. But you're coming in with something brand new that you wanted, that you didn't even have in your original. That wasn't even there when this began. I just feel you're going down this rabbit hole for no reason other than maybe it was all disingenuous to begin with, which is really a disappointment.
Okay, Councillor Affleck, closing.
To be clear, my original motion was absolutely 100% about knowing where the money was going and keeping it transparent and asking staff to come back with details of where that money would be spent. Councillor Louis added $300,000. The motion all changed. It all got all mixed up. Councillor Louis added the $300,000 in, which gave some definitive volume, amount of money. What I'm trying to do is bring back the transparency. I realize that Vision Vancouver are not big fans of transparency at City Hall. That is clear, and so after so many years in power. I find it apropos that Councillor Reimer refers to Orwellian, because it certainly feels like 1984 in the City Hall sometimes by the way this authoritarian style of government happens with Vision Vancouver. So perhaps you should read some of Orwell before you start touting him. I would say that without your support for this, I can't support the rest, because all I'm asking is that we have some clarity and some transparency. I know that's a word you may not even know how to spell, but it's important for us here at City Hall. It's important that we provide that we have transparency and that we make decisions based on the information that we're provided. And that's what I'm asking for, that staff provide us with the information so that we know what's going on. That's our job.
Okay, we'll call the question on the vote for a vote on this amendment. Councillor Affleck's amendment. Councillor Louis. And okay. We have 3 votes in favor, 8 in opposition. Robertson, Louis, Stevenson, Deal, Jang, Reimer, Meggs, and Carr opposed to that amendment. So the amendment fails. And we go back to, that was the final statement from Councillor Affleck stemming from his original motion. So we're ready for the question on the motion now as amended. We can vote on this at long last. And that is for up to $300,000 city manager to deploy on the fentanyl overdose crisis from the 2016 budget. Just waiting on Councillor Ball. There we go. 8 votes in favor, 3 opposed. Councillors Ball, Affleck, and DeGenova are opposed. The motion carries, and that means we have approved that urgent funding option for our staff to take forward for the coming weeks in the end here of the year here, 2016 year. And with that, we're on to Councillor Louis. Did you have new business, notice, motion, other matters? No. Okay. Councillor DeGenova. New business?
There actually also was an investigative report into loading zones and passenger zones. Actually, it was a story broken by Global TV on daycare parents who are getting ticketed, dropping their children off at daycare where there's no parking spaces close by. And it was discussed with the reporter by mother of a young child that she'd reached out to the city and explained she had been 4 minutes in the loading zone and that her ticket would still stand. I understand that a number of other parents were interviewed and have gotten tickets similar to this, and patients have actually gotten tickets similar to this when being dropped off or picking up a relative who needs assistance from a medical building. So I would just like to ask our staff to look into that and look into our policies, because as many councillors here pointed out today, daycare is extremely unaffordable for some parents who are just trying to afford to live here in the city of Vancouver. And if they don't have the means to be able to drop their children off at daycare, or their relatives or friends or people who rely on transportation to medical appointments, I just feel that those tickets could certainly be a burden. So I would just like to hear from staff as to how that will be addressed. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing a nod from our city manager on that. So Councillor Affleck, new business?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick request for leave of absence for Councillor Ball for this evening's public hearing, if I may.
Okay, moved and seconded. And any discussion on that? All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. Okay, anything further from council? We are done with new business and a motion to adjourn from Councillor Louis, seconded by Councillor Jang. All those in favor of adjournment? Any opposed? That carries. So we are adjourned from this last council meeting of the year, and we will be back at 6 o'clock tonight for a public hearing. And again, back here at 9:30 tomorrow morning for a committee meeting. We're done for the afternoon. Thanks.